The U.S. Supreme Court on Tuesday ruled that a contentious Texas law criminalizing unauthorized border crossings could go into effect for now, despite the federal government's claim that immigration enforcement is a matter for Washington. The 6-3 decision rejects a request by President Joe Biden's administration to halt the law while its challenge to the statute proceeds in the lower courts.
I have used a clause in the Constitution that empowers states to defend themselves.
That was Texas Governor Greg Abbott, almost 2 months after he signed SB 4, authorizing state law enforcement to arrest people suspected of entering the United States illegally, giving local officers powers long delegated to the U.S. government. Abbott said the law was needed due to Biden's failure to enforce federal laws criminalizing illegal entry or re-entry, leaving Texas to fend for itself. The Biden administration sued to block the measure, arguing that the state law violates the U.S. Constitution and federal law by interfering with the U.S. government's power to regulate immigration. All 3 liberal justices dissented Tuesday's ruling, with Justice Sonia Sotomayor along with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson saying the decision would invite, quote, further chaos and crisis in immigration enforcement. The Texas law made illegal entry or re-entry into Texas a state crime, with penalties ranging from 180 days in jail to 20 years in prison. The Democratic president's handling of the record number of migrants caught illegally crossing the U.S.-Mexico border during his presidency has drawn sharp criticism from Republicans. Republicans in February scuttled a bipartisan Senate deal that would have bolstered border security and tightened immigration laws after Donald Trump pushed members of his party to reject it.
Right now, SB 4 allows the state of Texas, law enforcement, local and state, Texas Rangers and the National Guard, to apprehend and incarcerate individuals who cross the border illegally. This incarceration can occur, and people who are caught multiple times, second and third and fifth, can be put into state prisons up to 20 years. There is a provision, of course, that when a person is caught, apprehended, and crossing the border illegally, they have the option of being deported immediately back to their country of origin. There are a lot of ambiguities in the law at this point. We assume that most people will choose a deportation. We have some data on this, and we know that many people who are caught and deported try again and again and again. The reasons here aren't important, but the important point is the state made it clear, as I read it, that if you're caught a second or multiple times, you get incarcerated. Well, you know, the Texas state prisons are overwhelmed, mostly by an understaffing, and it costs a lot of money to incarcerate someone. It's far cheaper than to ship them to Boston, Denver, and New York, which has been the policy in practice. So it's not clear how SB 4 is going to work. I think it would be fair to interpret it as a law never intended on incarcerating people, and a law intended really to deter people. It's a way of saying Donald Trump's back in business. We're not taking the federal government at its word. I think Biden will actually seriously think about doing some unilateral closing of the border. Why? If you allow the states to usurp federal authority here, and I'm not saying it's unambiguous as to what the Constitution says, that's for lawyers to decide. But we know for about 100 years, the states haven't been engaged in this kind of policy, no more than they have been in printing and coining currency. But if you let the states into this area, you open up a Pandora's box, and not just in immigration. What we can say with little doubt is that for the last at least 100 years, the federal government has had sole responsibility for managing and securing the borders. Now, of course, the state of Texas has said, you haven't done a very good job. Well, they probably haven't. But the simple fact of the matter is this Supreme Court has been very unambiguous about the role of executive agencies in making legislation, the EPA decisions recently. So, no, this is a 180. And we don't know what that 180 looks like, because although SB 4 does have, you could read the law, but enforcing the law and its implementation have a lot of nuances. And the same problems have occurred for the U.S. border and custom agents. When they apprehend somebody, they don't necessarily know their country of origin. They may admit to it or they may not. It's not clear that the country of origin they claim to be will accept them back. Oftentimes, what happens is the courts will say, well, if the law has irreparable damage or harm, then we're going to hold. But they didn't apparently think that implementing the law would create irreparable harm. In fact, I think some of the justices on the Fifth Circuit said the place the problem is so critical and so harmful that somebody's got to do something. That's crossing the line. The court is kind of making a policy decision. But again, that's my opinion.
The Supreme Court will allow Texas to begin enforcing a law that lets local police arrest migrants suspected of crossing the border illegally while a court fight over the constitutionality of the law plays out. The order reverses a Monday decision that would have kept the block on the law in place. The Supreme Court was divided on the order, with 3 liberal justices dissenting, some saying that it would cause chaos along the border. The conservative majority that allowed the law to go into effect did not comment on the underlying constitutionality of the Texas law. 2 of the justices who voted to lift the stay suggested their votes were more about the technical aspects of the appeals process rather than the underlying merits of the case. Texas Governor Greg Abbott said in a statement posted online that the order allows Texas to begin enforcing the law. An appeals court, though, is still considering its constitutionality, and exactly how it will play out on the ground remains to be seen. The Biden administration says this measure is a clear violation of federal authority that will sow chaos and confusion along the border.
I think it passes constitutional muster. I think it's the right policy for the state of Texas. We have to have a secure border, and that's not just a Republican, ideal. That is independents, that is swing voters, that's even some Democrats who want a secure border. So SB 4 goes a long way to address that, and it should be the law in the state of Texas.
I think it's too broad. Especially when you're in like a border town, it's like, how do you know that someone came in illegally or legally?
I would expect the court ultimately to strike the law down. It's extraordinary because it directly interferes with international law and federal determinations of who has the right to remain in the U.S. And that interference has pretty severe foreign policy consequences.